Hi, welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us this afternoon in the first of our Sit and Learn series. We're going to be talking with Eleanor Richard and Aspen Golan today. But the Sit and Learn series is in conjunction with the exhibit, The Art of Seating, 200 Years of American Design, which is on view at the LSU Museum of Art until June 6th. So a few housekeeping notes. Please keep your audio muted. You'll have a chance to ask questions directly to Aspen and Eleanor at the end. And you'll also have a chance to ask questions directly in the chat if you prefer to do so. Feel free to utilize the chat function and drop questions as we go. Sarah and Autumn will be adding links to relevant topics or places as the conversation goes along. And also, if you're in need of closed captioning, please utilize the link that is located in the chat for closed captioning. The LSU Museum of Art thanks partner sponsor David Boudet and Michael Robinson and presenting sponsor Taylor Porter Attorneys at Law for sponsoring the exhibit. Programming like the Sit and Learn series today is sponsored by the Cat. And then the Art of Seating is organized by the Museum of Contemporary Art, Jacksonville, in collaboration with the Thomas and Diane DeMel Jacobson Foundation. So Aspen Golan is an artist and a 17th and 18th century furniture maker who explores themes of gender and power through manipulations of classical American forms. She was just recently the woodshop coordinator at Penland School of Craft in Penland, North Carolina. She was also a 2020 John Minnick Fellowship Award winner and has held residencies at Winter Museum, Center for Furniture and Craftsmanship, and she exhibits widely, including this gallery, Site Brooklyn, Center for Furniture Craftsmanship. And she also teaches at a variety of arts and craft schools, like Mark Adams School of Woodworking, Pocosin Arts, Women's Workshop, and the North Bennett Street School. Eleanor Richards is she's currently a 3-year artist in residence at Penland School of Craft in Penland, North Carolina. She looks at both she looks at the tradition of woodworking and the ready-made to create eclectic assemblage, installation, and art objects that explore the intersections of labor and leisure. She was a 2019 resident at the Center of Art and Wood and has exhibited at the Mint Museum and Society of Contemporary Craft. She also traveled to Ghana to study woodworking techniques with support from the World Wood Organization. We just really thank Aspen and Eleanor for joining us today. If you haven't gotten a chance to come past the museum, if you're local or even regionally, please definitely take a chance and come past and see the Art of Seating. We are currently following all Louisiana COVID mitigation measures, and it's a safe option for those concerned for that. I also just wanted to share, before we got started with the conversation, a few images from the exhibit for those that are not local. So the Art of Seating, 200 Years of American Design, tells the history of modern design through chair. And so while these are all chairs, it's looking at that design and that evolution of design through the lens of a chair. And so it's touching on aesthetic trends, technology, social and cultural developments, and those are all reflected in the evolution of the chair form. Before we got started, I asked Eleanor and Aspen to look through the chairs and see which chairs really spoke to them in some way. And so I just wanted to briefly, before we got started with the conversation, see what they thought about the chairs that they selected.
Oh, is this one mine? You want to
Yeah, you can go ahead and start.
Yeah, I feel like anytime I see a Hunzinger, it ends up being my choice. And basically, I mean, I don't actually even know that much about Hunzinger. I just know that these chairs have this bizarre combination of like garish over decoration, but also, if you blur your eyes a little bit or step back, they have such incredibly beautiful proportions on like the most, simple Scandinavian level. And so I find them just like this beautiful combination of sort of repulsive and attractive simultaneously. I can't stop staring.
That's great. What about you, Eleanor?
I think that this is a great place to start. You sent us a list of like 52 chairs, and I really just tried to have like a gut reaction to like which one sort of excited me or like got me like, I don't know, reactive in some way. And I chose this office chair, like early 1800s office chair. And I am really into things on wheels, and this had this really nice apparatus cast in iron, and again, like over the top flamboyant design of very telling of the times. And it's not something I would ever want to live with, but I think that it sort of showcases design in a really interesting way, like the whole concept of trying to support the lumbar, and there's none other forms and such as the office chair that like tries to do that more effectively. And this is just a really fashionable statement of lumbar support, and I think that we've never quite lived up to these sort of standards, aesthetic standards since.
Right. Yeah, it's fun. It's a kind of a very serious design that's also playful, and so when you picked that, I was like, okay, this is one that Eleanor would look at. I think it also has movement as well, which I think about with your practice. It reclines slightly, can scoot around, which was a little unnerving for people at the time for a chair to be that active. But we're going to go ahead and get into the conversation with Eleanor and Aspen, and this is really split into three different topics. So design and practice, artwork, and then the larger community. I think a lot of times when we think about chairs, we have them in our house, we use them, we sit in them, we throw our bags on top of them when we come home from work. And a lot of times we don't think about the maker or how they came into existence or the design. So this is really a conversation of talking to two artists that are engaged in that practice, not entirely, both work with chair forms, but there's a larger practice, but also a lot of interesting play between tradition and innovation and creative playfulness. And so we're going to start off the conversation just thinking a little bit about how you came to woodworking and chairs. I think you'll both work with chairs in varying formats. And then a little bit about your design process. What happens in the studio? How do you get to the finished part? Where do you begin with? And I think we're starting with Aspen.
Awesome. Yeah. Well, how I got into woodworking and what I'm doing now are in some ways quite different. But how I got into it, honestly, I'm still fairly new to it. I didn't get started seriously until a few months before my 30th birthday. And I think, like many women, I lived in a world that largely assumed that I had no interest in woodworking, which in turn kind of made me think that I had no interest. So by the time I realized that I wanted to make furniture, and had admitted it to myself, I sort of decided to go in as hard as I could and went to the North Bennett Street School, which is just an incredibly sort of technical and skills-based program in early American furniture. And my goal was to sort of come out with as much sort of design flexibility and knowledge of the material as possible. That makes any sense? So yeah, I once also joked with a friend that I feel like I'm suited to woodworking because I have good ideas at a maximum rate of like once every 3 hours. And with woodworking and furniture, that's more than enough because it takes so long to realize things. And then, I mean, I think a less cheeky answer, and this is something that you'll see in my design process, is that I find boundaries very like liberating. And so for me, function acts as a boundary. And in some ways, those boundaries act as creative catalysts. And so I think ultimately, I just really like this balance between freedom and constraint that you experience when you're making furniture or items with function. So my design process, though, is very goofy and lighthearted. A friend and mentor of mine, Peter Galbert, once said this thing to me that the cost of iteration, if it's too high, means that you basically never come up with very much creative ideas because you can't give yourself the chance to like go back and make changes. So my early design iterations are done with things like clay here. So I'll just squish something around while I'm sitting on the couch until I come up with something I'm interested in. And that makes it really easy for me to change my mind or try something that might be, otherwise unlikely to succeed on a large scale, if that makes sense. The next slide shows a similar process that I actually do sometimes just with paper scraps on the floor. I don't know if you can forward to the next slide.
The candles.
Yeah, exactly. So sometimes like for this piece, the earlier part of this iteration was actually the pieces that you see in wood on the left side were done with pieces of paper that I spray painted with stripes and just had cut out and was sort of messing around with. And once I found the pieces that I liked to create sort of the visual balance I was looking for, I took those pieces of paper over to the lathe and turned all of the pieces I needed. And then of course, in reality, like it never, when it's in 3 dimensions, looks and feels the way that it does when it's in 2. And so I went through that process again once I had the physical objects and just sort of played with them in their rough state, and used pieces of paper on my porch to like indicate the candles, which are also part of that sort of overall structure. So yeah, I think that for me, it really is about like a good design process is one in which it is very easy to start over and to try something improbable or like likely without much a chance of success. So yeah, the next slide actually is of a Windsor chair and then of a miniature Windsor chair that it's not actually of my own creation. The miniature is done by my friend Greg Pennington, and I found it in his shop. But it's just because I couldn't find examples of the little mock-ups that I do of furniture, but they're often, with things that are pretty much garbage, which I think is kind of amazing when you compare it to the work that I sort of end up doing, which is often, aggressively technical in some ways. And like I learned again from Peter Galbert how to use floss and tape and, pieces of stiff paper in order to come up with ideas. I also have a very disorganized and intense like doodling practice. So about 30 active sketchbooks simultaneously that have things that, just essentially look like chicken scratch. But some of them to me are incredibly valuable and meaningful. And when I'm having sort of a blank spot when I come to the studio, flipping through those is honestly, it's a saving grace because I think we all go through phases of creativity and then production, and that those are sort of 2 different headspaces. So sometimes I'll have to dip back into a creative headspace and steal something for production time. But yeah, that's basically my overarching design process.
Right. So when you're creating a more traditional form, the brushes are something that you're working with, and those kind of candle forms. How different is your beginning stage with something that is technically like a Windsor chair or some of the furniture works that you do? How does that differ? Or is there like similarities that happen in that process?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question because honestly, the brushes themselves, I consider to be like a more evolved version of a doodle for a piece of furniture. And so my brushes are a way for me to try out in physicality and with like a little bit more, higher stakes than a doodle to, whether or not an idea holds any water. And when it comes to designing large scale furniture, a lot of the time for me, it like starts at a photocopier. So I'll pull out all of my design books and I'll just sort of space out and look at the Met collection for an era that I'm interested in, photocopy everything that I find fascinating, and then cut it up and sort of start putting things together in like a very sort of loose and intuitive way.
Mhm.
And oftentimes I'm guided by concept, and we'll get into that, but aesthetically, like, that is basically coming up with a beautiful design is the first step for me. And a lot of the time, as you'll see in my pieces, the area in which I sort of insert my personal voice is in these sort of framed elements. So it's almost like an intact piece of traditional furniture with these moments that are framed and then sort of subbed out with pieces that are original, like original pieces of two-dimensional art.
Right. I think you had mentioned before that that was kind of part of the North Bennett Street way of mapping out furniture. That there was, looking at museums or other chair makers process. Is that part of your beginning stage beyond, looking at those chairs online?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, highway robbery is a really important part of my process. So I do spend a lot of time just like straight up stealing elements and sort of collaging them together. So it starts in tradition. And then I think for me, not taking style for granted. And by that, I mean sort of on a conceptual level. I may be versed in 17th to 19th century American furniture, but that's not enough of a reason to be making it. So I had to start thinking about sort of the moral context of that furniture. And then once I started thinking about, historical context, moral context, I started asking myself questions that began to inform the work in more meaningful ways that then sort of guides me further. But I have about 1,000, to not be hyperbolic, I have about, let's say, 90 ideas for every piece that I make. And it's partly because the work is so arduous that, I think one of the struggles for me as a maker is just that I never get to see most of what I would like to make. So it's always like a very emotional, painful process of choosing which piece is going to get to be born and which piece is going to stay on the paper.
Great. All right. And Eleanor, a little bit about how you came into making, and especially like with wood and furniture, and then diving into your design process.
Yeah, I'd love to. I usually start all of my slideshows with a letter opener that I made in 7th grade shop class. My mom has saved 3 of them, one for me and one for my 2 brothers. And they're at home on her side table. And oh gosh, back then, like that was late 90s. I think it was probably the last like generation of shop class for my school district. So I always do feel quite lucky to have had that experience. I remember we were like sit around the linseed oil table, like oiling up our letter openers, gossiping, and I think I finished most of my friends just because I enjoyed it. But at the time, I didn't think basically what it was a little piece of wood that we like filed and shaped and, could also double as like a shiv or something, which is not like the most agreeable school item to make. But anyways, I didn't think at the time like, oh, this is my life's vocation. Like I'm not having this super connection with the material, but it was an art class and I got to be creative and make choices and, have autonomy. And so I sort of hold that experience now a little bit differently than I did at the time and realized that there was some value in it. I didn't really come back to woodworking until I was sort of almost through with college. I was an art education major and going in that direction, but a professor of mine picked up on my 3D design professor, sculpture professor, picked up on my sort of inclination towards working with wood as a medium and encouraged me. He ended up having pretty strong background in furniture making and graduated from the program of artisanry in Boston, and sort of was just running a sculpture program, but had all of this craft behind him that was revealed to me over the semesters. And by the end of it, I was kind of hooked, kind of way more interested in my studio life than my teaching life, and felt like if I did want to come back to teaching, I would have to sort of go through the ropes a little bit on my own as an artist. And so that's what, the next decade is intermingling those two things and finding resources to, garner more technical skill and push my ideas further and help me articulate both of those things in smoother ways. So yeah, I guess I just feel at home in a woodworking shop or a maker space, or I, just lose time. And I feel, very privileged to get to spend as much time as I do in those spaces. So anyway, I end up treating it like play most of the time. Like it doesn't feel like work when I'm in there. And so a lot of my work comes across as having that same level of open-endedness and intuitive approach that one might have when they're young and just sort of casually building with blocks or something. Wood is very agreeable to the act of play. It's tangible. It has tactile qualities. It's very direct. You can cut it up. You can paint it with ease, and it's right there in front of you. I'm also interested in the transformation that it can take, and a lot of times I'm influenced by process, and so these two images that we're looking at right now are actually like made from leftovers of other projects. And so I'll be making something and on a path and find myself way more captivated by the things that are falling by the wayside, the evidence of process. And so I started saving those pieces and building with them again and creating anew, and sort of it has become a very regenerative practice. But that's sort of evident in my approach to design. If you want to flip to the next one, I might share some thoughts also about the way that I respond to the people and places that I'm around. I've moved around quite a bit, searching for opportunities to be able to make, and inevitably whatever location I'm at and whatever community I'm with and whatever's happening outside with the weather and with the climate and the environment, all of that comes into play. And so these two images are reflective of the way that I tried to stay responsive to my environment, whether that's through, the quality of light, shadow, growth around me. Like I try and stay really open to the qualities that my environment are bringing to me. And then the next slide, I sort of like this comparison because it does speak to my interest in the gesture drawing. It was one of the first sort of classes I took coming up in my art background. And I just love what a gesture drawing, a small thumbnail sketch has to offer. So much energy and so much freedom is captured in just a few strokes of a pencil line. And so this is evidence of an initial sketch, an idea, and then the final product. And of course, after that thumbnail sketch, it's kind of like gloves off, like, let's get this done, do whatever it takes. And there's a lot that happens in between those two things, but it's really nice when you go back to that first time you put pen to paper. And is it possible to capture that in the finished piece? And that's a question I find myself asking more and more. And one final thought on my design process that sort of illustrates that, and maybe the next slide, yeah, is another illustration of that, where I just like took a picture of a site-specific installation and started sketching on it using digital drawing tools. And there it is next to a finished image of that sitting in space. And I just also I included a video. It's about like a minute long. We don't have to watch the whole thing, but it's of this piece coming to life. So yeah, I want to, bring it up. And you can mute that. Yeah, because that song is super cheesy. So I do shoot a lot of time-lapse videos in my studio, and this is one of putting that piece up. And I think it is interesting too, because in speaking about design, it's like you have this initial idea. It's like I wanted to make these light up chairs, and outside, and it became a question of like how do you make that functional, and then I had to build a stage to like house all the wiring and map that out underneath, and it became so much more than just like I want to make some like light up chairs. It sort of became something else, and this is like a kind of learning, another moment for me to learn from my environment, to understand that like a project might start off in a specific place, but it might end up somewhere very different.
Right. I mean, it seems like you, looking at how you document things through social media, which I think is like becoming like such a also like extension of like a studio practice, and even documenting this, like that becomes part of the process as well. It's the process of like getting what you're doing out to a larger community, but also like a process in seeing what you're doing as well. Do you feel like you consider steps or parts of your process differently once you've kind of reacted in that way after looking at it in like a documented way?
Yeah, I mean, documentation is huge right now. It always has been. And it is so integral to the finished product, and part of its story in the end. And the way I'm looking at it now is, having a product shot is necessary for professional development and for getting other opportunities. Like, yes, all about it. But where it lives in space, what environment it takes on, and then the character it absorbs after that, that's hugely critical too. And how do you document that? And that's a huge challenge, and gives a lot of information to people about craft in general and how it lives in the world, and also speaks to it's alive, it's living, it's not like dead after you make it. It has a life beyond the moment you finish it. And so that right there is sort of an interesting motivator to continue to document over the years.
Right. Yeah. It definitely does give a peek into, I think, what people think is kind of like invisible work, thinking about furniture or that sort of craft. I think people realize that there's a maker attached to it, but don't necessarily understand the process that goes into creating a piece. And I think too, like both of y'all through your social media practice, I think really gives a great insight into all those processes that people might not be familiar with. We're going to kind of go and look at, we got a chance to see some of the beginning stages of work, but we're going to transition into some finished works with Aspen.
Sorry. I was muted out of respect. There's some people walking around upstairs. It was really cool, actually, Ellie, just to hear all of that. Ellie and I are friends and have known each other for a long time, but it's funny how even sharing studio space doesn't always give an opportunity to just listen to another person talk for an uninterrupted period of time about their practice. So that was awesome. There's also a few questions in the chat, Grant. I don't know if you want to throw those out there about the design process just before we jump into the rest of the show.
Why don't we'll catch those at the end of the talk, and then we can kind of hit a couple of different slides so that people get kind of a full conversation.
Cool. Okay. Well, I'll just start with this piece. This is a piece that I got to make sort of with and under a master chair maker who I mentioned earlier named Peter Galbert. It's a Windsor style settee, and in a lot of ways it steals very directly from traditional comb back settee style. There's a few things that we had to shift about it because it was a commission piece, so it had to fit into like a curved entryway in a person's house. You know, like these are the kinds of problems we want to have, that your settee doesn't like kiss the wall of your like spiral staircase, right? So that was a really fun sort of structural thing to have to work around. And I really like this piece because of sort of these two things. One, the tension between contemporary and traditional style within it. And this one is really very traditional, but has a few like really classic sort of simplifications that allow it to be like a little bit more, I think, palatable to a contemporary household. And also that tension between something that, you know, was made out of the pure, you know, pure artistic curiosity and as a commission. I think that that's a really interesting thing to talk about as a furniture maker, because so many of us sort of live in between those two sort of production modes, you know, when you're making things that are really just pushing your career and your own artistic needs. And, you know, a lot of people say that in order to get the commissions that you want, you have to make the spec furniture that you want to be commissioned to make. And I think that's true. And it's a funny little catch-22 that I think studio furniture makers are really familiar with. And so this piece was one of those funny ones where, you know, I think given my druthers, I would have made something relatively similar, to be honest. But there were things about it that the client, you know, these requirements that the client had, like the dimensions and the color and the curve of the back. And those things became these really funny sort of sticking points that we got to design around. And again, just sort of bring it back to what I was talking about in my design process and how I got into woodworking and furniture specifically, is I'm fascinated by the no-go zones. Like I like navigating a complicated space. Like I like there to be things that can't happen. And that just gives me an opportunity to like either push that boundary or to sort of force my brain to take a less traditional path in order to achieve the thing that I want to achieve by working around those required structures. Also, Windsor furniture is just, it's worth talking about because it's coming up a lot in my career lately. But it's a very sort of sustainable way of making work. It's a very traditional way of making work. It's one of like the older furniture forms, and it can be made like this piece. We used a lathe that plugged in, and we used a bandsaw that plugged in, but I don't think there were any other power tools involved in the production of this thing, just like a handyman bag filled with some of the weirder curved tools you've probably ever seen. And just, you know, a specific set of things needed to make this object. And I think there's a beautiful relationship between the tools and the piece too, and the process and the piece. So yeah, this is definitely my favorite Windsor piece that I've ever been involved in. But if you go a little bit further, you'll see some of the sort of more traditional furniture that I made that also sort of incorporates my two-dimensional painting and drawing background. Yeah, this is a cabinet that I made when I was at North Bennett Street School. And this was sort of made at that end, sort of the end times at North Bennett, like my last semester when I was really starting to engage with the moral complexity inherent to reproducing furniture, like reproduction style and period style furniture. So the idea that the styles I was practicing adorned the halls of power in the early American period, and they called me to sort of ask the question, like, can this beauty or this style be disassociated from the racism, classism, and misogyny of that time? I think the answer is no. So I started incorporating imagery that sort of references the body and references furniture, playing like with the relationship between traditional female gender roles and the role of furniture in domestic space, in that furniture performs invisible labor. It welcomes, it hosts, it bears weight, it's seen and not heard. And so beginning to understand, that me as a female furniture maker, started to think about my gender and my gender in relation to the objects I was making and the roles that they played in the houses that they would eventually belong in. So this cabinet specifically sort of blurs that line between furniture and figure sculpture. You can see the positioning of those female bodies, and the loose cloth that hangs between them sort of transforms the act of opening the doors into a disrobing. So merely by using the cabinet as intended, the user kind of removes those coverings and enters the internal space of this cabinet body. And then on a traditional level, the draped cloth is kind of a play on early American carvings by Samuel McIntyre that typically feature cloth hanging in those catenary curves. So the intent, if you want to switch to the next piece, is really to sort of combine, I don't know how to put it, like these iconic decorative motifs with functional forms in a way that sort of explores female objectification and overuse, domestic labor, and I guess to some degree sexuality as well. This piece is a chair that's like a Sheraton style chair. It's of my own design, but it definitely is in that vernacular. But the face on the back is a piece of marquetry that is intended to sort of, again, blur that relationship between a chair back and a human back. And so, also using, I think there's something really fun and really sort of juicy to me about using traditional early American design methods like sand shaded veneer, which is what this is, to make imagery that is contemporary in its nature. And so that in and of itself is just a really fun combination that I can't seem to stop hitting. I think that the next pieces in here actually sort of shift into more contemporary work. I don't know if you want to flip a little further. Yeah, this is work that all started when COVID started, and I had to switch into a very small studio, and really very contemporary aesthetic, but extremely traditional methods used to create it. Like that striping is all taken from a historical banding class that I took and learned how to make, traditional inlay in early American furniture. So it's a bit of a tricky thing to learn how to do, but it's really fun to be able to apply it to something super dweeby like this. Yeah. Is that the last one?
So, yeah.
Oh, there's some more. Yeah. I think brush forms are, again, sort of just the way that I have been playing with like faster work, essentially, if that makes sense. Because some of this furniture stuff, God, it takes like months to complete a piece, from, that first terrible sketch to something real. And everybody needs a way to blow off steam and design more quickly. So that's been it for me.
Right. Yeah, I think it's interesting to think about that speed. And I think, even thinking about Eleanor's speed and
I'm so envious of it. I love how fast it works.
Right, but like responding to places and kind of that immediacy and needing to respond to like specific places or times. Yeah, I love the brush and even that connection between the veneer work, that it's really playing off those traditional methods this way. All right, and Eleanor.
I do. It's honestly like Aspen and I are living in this like Venn diagram right now. And just to paint you a picture, like she's in my studio right now and I'm up in Vermont teaching a class, and I used to be the wood coordinator and she's the wood coordinator. She's now leaving to go into her full-time studio practice. And like we met when I was at Penland, big craft school in Western North Carolina. And we worked together for the first time there. And we like hit it off right off the bat and like started collaborate. Like we made a chair together that week, right? Like it was, Yeah. We were like, let's do this. And so like when we're in the same, I'm speaking for myself, but I feel like when we're in the same space, when we're in the shop, I mean, it's super, I mean, I feel really activated, and I feel like there's a lot of crossover and also a lot of like diverging, and like it'll be really interesting, and I look forward to like, you know, watching our like paths continue to like interweave and intersect. And you know, this prime example, it's like Aspen's brushwork sort of intersecting with my broom work, and like the key difference here is like this work here is using all found objects, where like Aspen's brushes are like crafted individual designs, but yet they still like, we're both like still like super into like brushy things, you know, like on a really elemental level. And I'm like, yeah, so anyways, here we are, we're looking at so and also like themes, content in our work, themes of labor. As a person who was doing a lot of behind the scenes stuff as a shop technician at Penland, you know, I did absorb a lot of that invisible labor, and that sort of came out through me in this series of work where I was taking the objects I was using to, you know, manage the space with, and give them an animated life of their own, give myself a chance to blow off a little steam, so to speak. And so this work, you know, maybe I make some more down the road, but I sort of work in series. And this was sort of encapsulated in a certain amount of time. And there's many more brooms with line work that are part of this, that the framework of using the broom and space and the environment that it's presented in, it's taken on a lot of different avenues. So this sort of framework of using those things has allowed me to explore a lot of different areas of content. And if you switch to the next one, this will carry over into other objects that, you know, you might find in a garage or, you know, a workshop. And, you know, after you spend so much time in these environments, the stuff does start to come to life in a new way. And I think I spoke a little bit about like my interest in this intersection of work and play. And I have this belief that, you know, you can't have one without the other. And there's an exchange there. And that exchange of seriousness with spontaneity is really at the core of my practice. And so, you know, I do like to iterate and ideate and produce. And I like the speed of that to match, you know, where my ideas are at. And so I often have to create parameters that allow me to do that. And sometimes that's working with found objects, because it's a lot of resource that's already right there. It's also charged with content. And so, you know, I do look at like my source material. Where is it coming from? What story is it bringing to me? And where am I carrying it forward from there? So this is just sort of little amalgamation of reconfigured rulers, yardsticks. And the next slide, I chose to include a piece that I made at the Center for Art and Wood residency, which was an 8-week program with around 8 artists living and working together in the center of Philadelphia. And this was right after I left my position as the wood coordinator, and sort of leaving Western rural North Carolina and going to the big city was a really big, exciting moment for me. And I sort of went from you know, not leaving my key. I went from leaving my keys in my car to, you know, having like a big hefty key set that like every door I needed access to, every door was locked. And so it was just a real sort of shift in my, in how I navigated the world. And it was really sort of woke me up a little bit. And, you know, most everything in the city is chained up and chains used as a barrier. And I've just been looking at the chain, and looking at also folk art, and looking at what how can I use this the sort of visual language of links to talk about what a chain can symbolize, which is both containment and connection. And so these opposing forces of feeling restricted and feeling free and connected to someone are sort of evident in this piece for me. And the next one is a lighter sort of body of work that I would compare to Aspen's brushes, in that these are bandsaw boxes that allow ideas to live on a smaller scale, sort of a test kitchen, if you will. These boxes are, maybe a foot big, so that this is very handleable object, encouraging engagement. And I like them to live as sort of discrete sculptures in space, and only those, willing to engage with their environment will maybe understand that this object has more to offer them. And with that in mind, I'll sort of end with this last piece that I made at the start of quarantine, actually last year. And this is a found rocking chair found on the side of the road. Didn't have a bottom in it. And I dragged it back to the studio, and had been thinking about, all of us sitting at home and staring at our furniture for the first time in a long time, and like thinking about the relationships that people may be forming with their furniture. Is it taking on a new life for them, have to spend so much time with it? So really thinking about how can furniture also be less passive, be less something that we sort of sink into and experience the external world. What if we experience the internal world of a piece of furniture? And the Labyrinth rocking chair is something that practices that, or encourages the practice of that by, in order for it to, fully live, you have to step behind it and, grab onto the finials and navigate a steel ball through the maze, a carved maze that is a labyrinth. And this is sort of maybe a direction where I'm sort of I'm interested in iterating this a little bit further, just to give you an idea of where I'm at right now with my studio practice.
Yeah, it seems like, do you find you create those boundaries or parameters, is that influenced by place and time of where you find yourself, like in these residencies or making practice? How much of that influences those kind of rules that you set for yourself?
I would honestly wish it influenced me less.
Yeah.
Right, but it's a reality. It's a reality thing. Like sometimes I feel like I only have so much time, or only have this much energy to spend, whether that's, resources on material or physical energy or emotional energy or whatever. I honestly wish that the limitations weren't there, but at the end of the day, you get to have a conversation about something that was finished, and you get to reflect on it, and you get to grow from it. And so I'd rather have those takeaways than just like live in an endless like pit of limitless joy of making. So yeah.
We're gonna share. I wanted Aspen and Eleanor to talk just a little bit about, the community. We think about like makers being this kind of like singular body, or someone in a studio designing away, and I think they're both really connected and broadening that community and bringing more people into making and thinking about how to strengthen that community. And so we're going to talk a little bit about community, and then we'll take some questions for Eleanor and Aspen. We're going to start off with Aspen.
Okay. Yeah, it's a really interesting question. I mean, I think outside of practical considerations like business models, furniture and design lines, I think that every maker needs a robust community. And in addition, the woodworking field is it's full of wonderful individuals, but is also famous for its lack of racial and gender diversity. So I've been really intentional about creating safe space within woodworking, at least to whatever extent I'm capable. So a year ago, I began serving on the board of a workshop of our own, which is a wood shop in Baltimore that serves women and non-gender binary woodworkers, and also serving as an ambassador to Fine Woodworking magazine, which, while it is a cornerstone of the woodworking how-to world, it doesn't currently do justice to the diversity of that field. So in those two roles, like, I find myself sort of able to connect to two communities that really define my personal practice, and sort of basically be a bridge between them. Sometimes I think about myself as like the jacket laid across the muddy, across like the muddy field, so people can sort of like reach each other. But my main work in community, in the community of woodworking right now, is through or funded by the John D. Minnick Furniture Fellowship, which I was lucky enough to win in 2020. So it's an amazing prize and opportunity. It's given each year to a furniture maker, and comes with some really significant prize money. So if you flip to the next slide, you'll see my goal is really focusing on the Windsor chair form. It's a highly accessible process with low startup costs, but it's nonetheless relatively cloistered and inaccessible. So I've broken down my approach into this three-pronged plan. So the first one is sort of what this image is all about, which is design new and teachable Windsor chair forms. And not to say this is new, it's definitely a riff off of something that has been around a long time, but trying to break down this form into something that's essentially just a stick figure of itself. If you move to the next slide, you'll see the second piece is commissioning others to make the teaching sets of Windsor tools that I'll use to travel and teach these forms. I believe that like scholarships are incredible, but I always find that, giving somebody access to a field that they don't otherwise have access to for a short period of time, paid for by a patron, is not nearly as empowering as finding a way to essentially pay people or give people a chance to create their own living in a field. And so that's what the goal of this was. Like, not only do I get the tools I need to go teach these forms in more diverse spaces, but also I'm bringing in these people who are talented metal workers and tool makers, but not necessarily familiar with Windsor chairs and Windsor chair forms, and using my community of Windsor chair makers to create that connection. I think the next slide is the third piece of it. Feel free to ask a question too. I'm talking fast because I know we're getting to the end of our time. So this is the last piece of the project. It's not technically Windsor based, but it happened because of the way that I received my Windsor chair tools. So I received my Windsor chair tools because of a man who was retiring from the field, decided that he no longer needed his tools and he wanted them not to be sold, but to go to someone who would use them. And it was such an incredibly powerful gift for him to be able to give these things to somebody, and such a life-changing gift for me, that I realized that we're surrounded by these wood shops that are just disappearing onto Craigslist, or being, like rotting in a basement or rusting in a basement. And so I am creating a program that collects tools from retiring makers and redistributes them as scholarships to outsiders in fields. So these are photos of me collecting and organizing our first major shop donation in Atlanta, Georgia, who is a man who's a luthier for 50 years. So yeah, just look at those tiny little hand planes. It's just an incredibly beautiful experience for me, and I think for his family, and soon to be for our young luthier who will receive them.
Awesome.
These are fun. Your little
oh yeah, I forgot I threw these in here. That's the last little piece, is that I'm trying to make social practice not a sort of impermanent or random part of my practice. I don't want it to be something that just I do a raffle every once in a while when there's a need. Instead, I'm trying to basically create an entire body of work that is specifically created to be sold, and then the money to be donated. And so these are boards that I made because I'm collaborating with Shaper Tools, which is basically like a router CNC company, essentially. So I'm able to make these Doodle Boards relatively quickly. I mean, they still take time, but I have a standard price, and I'm able to produce them and then sell them anytime and consistently when money is needed. And I'm also collaborating with other designers and makers within this small format to then produce these boards and bring in other people who are able to like give their time and energy to, you know, basically drumming up money for all of the many things that we need, all the changes that we need in our field.
Right. Yeah, I think people sometimes forget, if they're not familiar, like how closed of a circuit, you know, fine arts or like contemporary craft can be. So I'm really excited to see what comes from this project.
Me too. I think that like the funny thing about being a maker is that we so often feel once you are a maker, you're like, oh, all my friends are makers. It's so easy to be connected to makers, but it's not until you are, you know, so there is like, it's very important that once you have a foothold in making, that you extend that to other people.
I 100% agree with everything you just said, by the way. Those are some amazing projects. I'm so excited for them. And I guess, yeah, to sort of, I'm going to end on something that we're both involved with, and we're going to lead up with a few projects that symbolize for me the importance of engaging the outside world with your studio practice, and then kind of creating something good in that effort, creating change in that effort. And this is an example of a tiny house that I organized the build for, that was taken from old materials from old buildings, all reclaimed. And so in order to do that, I had to call upon a lot of local resources and sort of local people to help me accomplish this goal. And in that, the object itself, the house, carries with it all of this inherent knowledge. And this is a space that like will now tell a story of, you know, one building in particular, a historic building from Penland's campus, and then you know, provide space for affordable living space for someone. Going project here, but it's sort of a nice starting point for me, because it just you know, when you're thinking about community engagement, sometimes it just means walking outside your door and looking around and seeing like what needs mended or what's broken and how can I fix it and create something new. And next slide. Since being back at Penland, I sort of been taking on a few like community engagement classes with the youth. And because of my art education background, it's something I always want to include. I really do like working with kids. I didn't want to go into it full time, but I love having side gigs that like allow me to get involved with this population. And so I was tasked with creating a video of making an assignment or craft assignment for people in the rural area which I live, that they could have all of the supplies come from their home. So they wouldn't have to go buy anything. And so came up with this kite design that's just trash bags and sticks, a little bit of tape and glue, and the things fly. And it was really just a lovely question. It was a good opportunity for me to ask myself, like, you know, if you're trying to provide somebody with an opportunity, what are you asking of them, and is that fair? You know, like it's one thing to you know, I think this is what's happening with Aspen's chair design. She's paring it down so that it is an accessible designed form, and it's like this simple trash kite, you know, doesn't cost a thing, and it's not asking you to have something before you've tried to do the thing. And that's really an important component with this community engagement work and social practice. Next slide is another sort of outreach program that I'm running right now, which is virtual art club, after school art club. And this is, you know, teenage age kids who've been, you know, quarantined or, you know, working from home or working virtually. And these are a couple of kids that high schoolers that we're meeting once a week, and we talk art and we gather, and it's a really it really is putting me in touch with what the word community means on a really basic level. It's like community is like, again, who's outside your door, like who's down the road, who's in your county, who's in your region, and what does that have, what's there for you to learn from and for you to be sort of more engaged thinker and person in that specific region that you live. And then ending on, I think, a couple, Aspen and I are both pretty involved with Furniture Society, which is a national organization for furniture makers. And another good friend of ours, Annie Evelyn, and I are involved in a collaboration project called Craft for a Greater Good. And again, for out of respect of our time, I do encourage you to check out our Instagram, Furniture Society at CGG. Essentially what we're doing here is Furniture Society has a conference every year, and it's our initiative to connect more effectively with the host cities and doing a project with them. And in this case, we're making furniture for micro homes and tiny homes in a homeless village, or a tiny house village for the homeless population. And lastly, these are just resources for you guys. Aspen and I are both members of Crafting the Future. I sincerely hope that you all, if there's one actionable, item from this talk, it would be to visit the Crafting the Future website and poke around and see if you're interested in becoming a member, because what this is doing is the membership dues are creating a fund that is supporting BIPOC individuals, getting people in craft schools who where access is typically, again, not within arm's reach. And so this is a scholarship fund organization that is also just like a dang good time. There's lots of like fun IG stuff that happens live, and tons of great artists that they're elevating and supporting. And I highly recommend getting involved. It's a really good time.
Awesome. Well, we're going to open up to anyone that has any questions for Eleanor and Aspen. I know we're running a little bit over, but if anybody has questions, I invite you to either raise your hand or unmute and ask. Yes.
I think I'm addressing it to both of you, so either of you can answer. But it seems like you've both been somewhat migratory in how you've structured your creative lives, and have moved around and pursued residencies and opportunities. And I wonder if that's something that you think is appropriate, like at a certain time in your career, or do you want to continue to do that the rest of your life, or was your goal to sort of build networks by doing that? And how, if you could just talk about that a little bit, like how it's worked well, or what's challenging about it. And yeah, I'll just leave it at that. I threw out a lot of questions, but if you could just talk about that kind of approach that you've taken in recent years, just sort of watching you all move around. I never know what state you're in.
I was living in Tom Lozier's house last year. That tells you anything.
That super cool rocker is downstairs.
Aspen, do you have thoughts?
Sure, yeah. My first thought, Tom, is that sort of this phase of my life kind of reminds me, I mean, if we're talking about, connections to the practice, like the iteration or doodling part of my practice. Like this phase where I'm sort of traveling around and collecting things and sort of following instincts more than, I wouldn't say that anything that I've done has been calculated. It's been instinctual. And so moving and collecting things that feel valuable and reaching out to communities that feel safe or that push me one or the other and sort of like cultivating something that that feels like fertile ground that I can grow from is critical and has been an important part of this time. And while I am in my early 30s, like I'm in my 4th year of making furniture. And so this is a very early part of my career in the way I think about it. But I also know that coming up, like the ability to make that bigger work and sort of move out of the doodle phase is going to require like a deeper commitment to a location, I think, for me. And that's something that I can very much tell is like sort of the next phase. And that again came more as like an intuitive acknowledgement of where I wanted to go with my career and what I wanted to do with it, rather than something that I had like intentionally sort of scheduled. So yeah, I think that like there are negatives to embarking on a big project because it limits your scope, and there are like negatives to choosing a location and setting up a shop. But I think there's a point in the career where there's, or at least for me, there's like a tipping point where the benefits outweigh the costs, and like the bigger projects require that deeper level of commitment.
Thanks.
What about you, Ellie?
Oh, I have. Oh, I like what you said about it feeling like instinctual. And I think it does feel that way for me. It's almost like also with that comes survival. And oftentimes I'm moving because there's an opportunity in front of me that feels necessary. Like it's the only way that like I'm gonna get to like have that see that fertile ground and exercise my creative practice, which is like like sort of like the compass, or you know, the foot on the gas pedal sort of thing. That's sort of what's driving this bus. But I think so yeah, being able to do that, yeah, it's tough if you have a family, if you are at a particular stage in life where your responsibilities are tying you to a more rooted situation. So it's going to happen at different times for different people. I've worked at a lot of places where very supportive of people at all stages of life. I'm teaching a class right now where, you know, there's veterans involved and really making major life changes, you know, all the way down the line. And you know, Penland's a place where people are coming from 18 to 80, and I truly hope that, you know, that yes, I want to be rooted in place, but I truly hope that this isn't something that I get off at the last stop sort of thing. And that might mean that like I live somewhere forever, but like that mentality, I think it's just more of a mentality. Yes, it's a lifestyle, but it's also just like how your mind can help you get to new places through travel.
Yeah, I just want to add to that, Ellie, like so well said. And that like, because I'm kind of a homebody and a person who likes consistency, and the interesting thing is like my life does not reflect that in any way. Like I travel constantly and I move constantly, but for me, like my making practice is so, it's very calm and it's very intimate and it's very personal and it's very like, it evolves, but it is like always in the same place within me. And so it's like being able to return to that is what makes all the other shifting possible, I think. So the time when I feel truly like a traveler in a negative sense, like I'm stuck in an airport, is like when I don't have access to a form of making. And then I start feeling like the time, like the clock starts, and I can only stay in that space for so long.
Thank you.
Do we have any other last questions for Aspen and Eleanor? I definitely hope, you know, take a look at some of those links. Crafting the Future is great. It also supports students down the road in New Orleans at Yaya for scholarship opportunities, to go to craft schools and programs and workshops and apprenticeships. And yeah, definitely give Aspen and Eleanor a follow and follow them along on their making journey. I think what we talked about is kind of documenting that process is really, really interesting, and interesting for people that, you know, this is something to pass time, but also people that might be interested in giving woodworking or making a try. I know Eleanor's got a lot of like fun little like accessible, she made like a chair out of a sweet potato or carrot, or like little collage things. Aspen does kind of fun projects along the way as well. Also, if you're local, you know, definitely come past the museum, check out Art of Seating. You're all registered to receive reminders about the Sit and Learn series we've got coming up on April 11th, a conversation with local designers and collectors of furniture. It's kind of a fun coffee style conversation. And then on April 29th, we'll be talking with local designer Damian Mitchell. But I want to thank Aspen and Eleanor for joining us today and giving us a peek into their process and making and what they're doing outside of the studio as well.